Hi, this is Paul. The world is changing. Ross Douthat, New York Times opinion columnist, is podcasting up a storm. He just did a big conversation with Ezra Klein, Ezra Klein's podcast, The Ezra Klein Show. Fairly popular podcast, 320 subs on YouTube. I'm sure its reach in podcast land is quite a bit further. And Douthat is doing his own now, Interesting Times with Ross Douthat, where he had Father James Martin. And Father James Martin is a Roman Catholic priest who has spent a lot of time on trying to, how shall I say this, trying to minister to the LGBTQ community as a Roman Catholic priest. Both podcasts are very worth listening to on a lot of different levels. And I'm not quite sure where all this video is going to go to, because I really want to talk about what I've been reading in this book, John O'Malley's Vatican I, The Council and the Making of the Ultramontane Church. If you go back to my conversation, I've made a bunch of noises on Twitter about how during synods, Christian Reform synods 2022 to 2024, all of these people from the corner were watching and they just couldn't take their eyes off it. And now I'm sort of doing the same thing with the Roman Catholic Church, because a la my conversation with Cale Zeldin recently, I'm absolutely fascinated at what's going on in the church. This morning's big thread on CRC Voices is an article by the Christian Courier. Now, Christian Courier is a Canadian magazine that tends to center around the Christian Reformed Church in Canada. It's not an official magazine of the denomination like the Banner, which actually in many ways helps it to be often... I would say the Christian Courier is cited more often on CRC Voices than the Banner is, to give you a sense of, at least for the CRC Voices type of people in the Christian Reformed Church, how much they think the Courier better has its finger on the pulse than the Banner does. And it just recently did a little survey. And the title of the article is Empty Council Rooms of CRC Members in Canada Surveyed, 62% will no longer sign the Covenant of Office Bearers. Spring is nomination season. That time of year when the church councils thank retiring members and count empty seats to see how many new office bearers are needed. This spring, however, it might be harder than usual to find new members ready to take on leadership roles. At least if the Christian Courier survey results are any indication, that's because decisions made at Synod 2024 are having an impact not only on the future of the denomination as a whole, but on local churches. And group of people saying out of the almost 1,200 participants, 745 said they will not sign the covenant for office bearers going forward. Now, a bunch of people on Voices then went down to the chart showing ages of this. And so 18 to 24-year-olds usually not office bearing. 25 to 34-year-olds, people coming into the office of deacon. It was so interesting when Christian Reformed Synod and Classes, Christian Reformed Church mandated that inclusion of deacons at Classis and Synod. Synod used to be 2 ministers, 2 elders. Then a number of years ago, Synod said 1 minister, 1 elder, 1 deacon, and then 1 of any of the 3. Now, what's interesting is that, again, I think with the boomer leadership of the church, the assumption was that the inclusion of deacons would make the Christian Reformed Church more progressive. And I think the opposite happened. The inclusion of the deacons made the Christian Reformed Church more conservative because, again, many of the children of the boomer generation that were progressive like their parents left the church and are not office bearers. It's the children of conservatives and conservative people in the Christian Reformed Church who have been filling out those ranks. And so as the boomers slowly age out of the church and age out of office, usually it's unusual to have someone in the Christian Reformed Church in office over the age of 80. And even in the 70s, councils stop asking them. And this is particularly in areas of the Christian Reformed Church where most of the Christian Reformed Church is, let's say in areas of the country like West Michigan, or in Canada, Toronto, Ontario area, or even Edmonton, Ontario. Once people who live up in northern regions, if they have some money and if they are retired, they're getting up in age, they tend to winter in Florida and Arizona, and that will often be a reason why they won't be put up for officer in the church, because the assumption is, you can go on vacation and stuff, but you should be at the church year round. And so a lot of boomers have sort of retired out of office. And so when it comes to voting in the Christian Reformed Church in many places, well, the younger people are voting, and the younger people, again, tend to be more conservative. It was very interesting in the Father James Martin conversation, where Douthit makes the point that the boomers, of course, were so formed with the idea of them as the younger generation and as the generation of the future, that it's really difficult for them to get their minds around and stomach the fact that, at least in the church, in society overall, that's a different story. It's more complex. But at least in the church, the younger generation is more conservative. And you can see this with Douthit, who's more conservative, and Martin, who's older. And the whole conversation was quite interesting. Now for me, and then you have Ezra Klein, such an interesting conversation in terms of what is happening in terms of religion in America. I don't know if we'll get into that at some point, but I definitely, because I want to get into Vatican I, because as Cale noted, Vatican I doesn't really end until sort of Vatican II is called. And the scope of change in the world and in the church in this time period, and the difference of the world from then to now on so many levels, is just breathtaking. And when you look, I think we are sort of used to seeing those differences, let's say, in technology, but I don't think we're used to sort of getting our minds around them with respect to religion. Boy, this history is so interesting. Vatican I, for the first time, no laity took part in the council, even though the laity had an extraordinarily important impact on the council in other ways. That's quite a piece. And again, especially because the Council of Trent really tries to push back the Reformation. By the time you get to Vatican I, in some way, and remember, they hadn't had a council for a very long time. The previous council, yeah, that's right. I thought so, but I wanted to check it before I said it. The council prior to the Vatican I was the Council of Trent in the 16th century. One of the things that I notice when I read Roman Catholic Church history in the 19th and 20th centuries is just how much reacting and sort of ancient modern innovating they have to do. Because, of course, there are many early church councils, Council of Nicaea, Council of Chalcedon. I mean, all those early church councils. And then, over 300 years between the Council of Trent and Vatican I. And then, of course, Vatican II is going to follow after Vatican I. But whether we use the same word council for all of these things as if they're sort of the same thing, but are they? A big element of this question about the papacy is, does the Pope speak from the church? In other words, the church, does the Pope speak out to the world from the church? In other words, the Pope is summarizing the teaching of the church. Or does the Pope, in a sense, turn towards the church and speak to the church what her teaching is? That dynamic just passes back and forth through this. Now, of course, in some ways one might say both, but it's a matter of emphasis. So the Ultramontanism, or the Ultramontanes, these are the group for the high monarchistic imperial papacy. And in Vatican I, they're sort of in competition with the national churches. Is there a sense that, let's say, the German synods are in tension with Ultramontanism today? Well, we'll see. The Ultramontanes of the 19th century, infallibility was the core of their movement. And the more aggressive among them saw the council as their opportunity to vindicate it. An irony is in play here. The Ultramontanes seized the council as their opportunity to prevail. Yet the council's definition seemed, in the eyes of some, to render councils outmoded. In other words, what the Ultramontanes sort of want to do is for the council to say that the Pope tells us what to do. Well, why all this emphasis on the papacy? Well, part of it was they're wrestling with modernity. And they're wrestling with, a funny thing happens in modernity where you would think in modernity that monarchies would just completely pass away, but they don't. What you get is sort of this weird division where you have in monarchies getting more and more dictatorial, but then also more fragile. And it's just a fascinating dynamic. If in the 19th century infallibility gained ground because of badly unsettled political conditions, and again, if you look at the political conditions in Europe in the 19th century, you might argue that there hadn't been a major war for a while before the First World War at the beginning of the 20th century, but there's tremendous upheaval going on throughout Europe with respect to questions of authority. Where does authority come from? How is it recognized? How is it played out among the people? If you recognize that Napoleon, not on one, but on two occasions, invades the Papal States and takes the Pope prisoner. I mean, just think about that today. Can you imagine if Putin rolled his tanks into Italy and took the Pope prisoner and maybe brought the Pope back to Moscow and made him bow before the Metropolitan of Moscow? I mean, just think about that. Just try to imagine that today. And the fact that this is almost unthinkable speaks not just to our assumptions of the way the world works, but ironically, it speaks to the weakening of the papacy. And in some ways, Vatican I tries to shore up the papacy because it had been so thoroughly weakened. Unsettled political conditions. Its rise was just as due to the cultural, social, and intellectual changes the modern world posed for the Church. The scientific revolution threatened the Aristotelian system that had undergirded Catholic theology since the 13th century. The rationalism of the Enlightenment upset the balance between faith and reason in traditional Catholic theology and, in its extreme form, recognized no God but reason. The French Revolution's cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity undermined ecclesiastical as well as political hierarchy, a problem compounded by the Industrial Revolution's creation of the urban proletariat, claiming, sometimes with sticks, stones, and muskets, a voice in affairs. The bourgeoisie's demand for the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion spelled, it seemed, the end of the discipline required to maintain public order in church and state, and new forms of biblical criticism threatened the credibility of the Bible. These and similar phenomena constituted for most Catholics the major and most persuasive problems of the day, an opinion shared by Pope Pius IX. They challenged the very foundation upon which the Church and society had rested since time immemorial. The crisis was one of authority. So, of course, you get in the French Revolution, and as the French Revolution, you can listen to the rest of history. They got plenty of podcasts on it. They've been doing the French Revolution not too long ago now. At the beginning, of course, certain elements of the clergy are sort of lined with the revolution because many of those clergy are poor. They're closer to the people. They see the suffering of the people. The bread crisis is going through France. But then, of course, once the French Revolution gets going, one of the things that the French Revolution is going to do is tear down the ancient regime. And of course, all of the traditional structures that have held society together of nobility and the clerical aristocracy, this all gets taken down. Papal lands get taken, church lands get taken, and governments increasingly, of course, you have the rise of the nation state. Governments in these very Catholic lands, the emperors and the kings, are increasingly demanding and, in fact, insisting that they name bishops. They name the bishops. Well, why? Now, again, there's an irony in here because we wouldn't imagine the United States government demanding that they name local church ministers or even Roman Catholic or Anglican bishops or Orthodox bishops. They would just shrug. In fact, it shows just how much the world has shifted in that mayors, well, a mayor in a place like New York City, might want to meet with the Catholic hierarchy there. They've got a degree of importance, but how much importance do they have?
I also wonder, though, in this landscape, right, like how much influence can a pope or the hierarchy have over Catholics, lay Catholics, not priests and religious, but lay Catholics who disagree with them, right? Because you said, well, hopefully the hierarchy unites us. Hopefully the Pope unites us. I think the Pope is unifying, but since the sex abuse crisis, right, I think, when I think about, like, how ordinary Catholics think about the hierarchy, just in my own lifetime, I think it's changed dramatically, and people have just less respect for the bishops than they did. Yeah. And just in terms of, like, Catholic politics, right, that cashes out in this world where, it just doesn't seem like the bishops have very much authority over Catholic politicians, for instance. So for a long time, you had pro-choice Catholic politicians who, favored abortion rights, and the bishops would criticize them. And that didn't seem to go anywhere. And now you'll have something, sort of politicians on the right who take anti-immigration stances, and the bishops will criticize them. And that doesn't go anywhere either, right? So do you think that the hierarchy has real influence? Can it regain real influence of that kind? Or is it just stuck sort of presiding in this way that doesn't matter that much to a lot of ordinary Catholics?
That's a great question. I definitely...
This doesn't make any sense apart from democracy, which shows just how much the Catholic Church has lost. Because it's not the case. The only reason, let's say, a mayor or a governor or a senator or a president might care what the Pope or a church leader thinks is because they're worried about the votes. And so even for Douthits, it's, the influence of the Pope comes through the people. That just shows you how democratic this all has become. Because there's no concern of, the Pope is going to excommunicate. Well, we've had 2 Catholic presidents. There was a little bit of time when there was some drama that maybe the Roman Catholic Church should excommunicate American politicians who are pro-choice on abortion. And that didn't go anywhere. And so what exactly are the keys of the kingdom that these clerics have beyond the influence of the people?
I think you're right that the bishops have less authority in the wake of the sex abuse crisis. I think the Pope still has a great deal of influence, and I think it's, as you were saying earlier, it's not just his words, but it's his deeds. I think that they can help people understand Catholicism and Christianity more. That's an influence, right?
Okay, but it's so interesting because it's going to be predominantly symbolic, which is going to sort of put you over into the Ezra Klein conversation, because Ezra Klein is going to be getting a sense of like the vibes and the feels and the experience that he had on ayahuasca, et cetera, et cetera.
I think when he does speak out on the death penalty, on migrants and refugees, on the environment, I do think Catholics listen, maybe not to their local bishop. I've often had the experience of saying to someone, both of us are very attentive to these things. I'll say, by the way, what diocese are you in? And they won't know.
Yeah.
I was like, well, I remember saying to a very good Catholic whose name I won't remember, well, you must know what diocese you're in. When the priest says the Eucharistic prayer and puts the bishop's name in, what does he say? I don't know. But they know the Pope, Right.
They know the Pope. The Pope is in some ways the celebrity. And that, of course, well, he's going to say a little bit more.
And so I think he can have a great deal of influence. And Ross, it's interesting. You're talking about that where he embraced that man with the skin condition. And, I looked at that and I was terribly moved. And I thought, he's influencing me. And he didn't say anything to me. I just saw this picture. So that's a kind of influence, and that's a kind of teaching, and that's a kind of unifying effect, right? Do you know what I mean? So it's beyond the kind of hot button issues we were talking about. So the answer is yes, he can have an effect. And, local bishops can do that from time to time. I don't want to dump on the bishops, but I think people see them less.
No, I think, they can, but I think certainly bishops' bureaucracies, national councils of bishops and so on, I feel like imagine themselves having a kind of authority that has completely evaporated. And personally, I would like to live in a world where Catholic politicians of both the left and right, not a world where they changed their position entirely because of something a bishop said, but a world where they felt like they had to address a bishop's critique. And I just don't know how we get back to that world, right? I feel like, and I'm curious for your reaction to this, but I've been writing about this a little bit lately. I feel like there is a renewed interest in religion in the Western world right now, definitely. But I think it's happening very much at a kind of ground level, and maybe that's where renewal always happens, right? But it's people reacting, as you said, to sort of what's going on in the world, things in their own lives. But it's not about suddenly having the debate about gay marriage settled or anything like that. But it's almost, if I'm being optimistic, I would say it's almost people moving past some of the culture war arguments that you and I have been having for a long time and just sort of saying, well, these are not fully resolved, but I'm going to go back to church anyway. But there's also a way in which it feels like it's happening and it has nothing to do with the hierarchy of the church. The hierarchy is just sort of not in the action at all.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think it's that, people probably are looking at their secular lives, their secular lifestyles that might be, not have God in it, and say, this feels empty. And I really believe that in every person's heart, there's a natural desire for God. And I think if that's suppressed, it eventually comes back. And I think that's what's happening kind of culture-wide. I think people are finding the secular world kind of empty, right? I mean, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, said St. Augustine. And I think that's what's happening, finally. I'm surprised it took this long, actually. But yeah, I don't think it has a whole lot to do with, the local bishop or the...
And what's so interesting is that when I hear him say it, it just sounds platitudinous. It just... No, I don't wear a clerical collar. Jacob bought me a couple. I still have them. The collar was a little small. I'm a little bigger than Jacob thought. Since the Middle Ages, Italy consisted of a number of independent states. With the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire in 1814, these states were reconfigured and reconstituted by the Congress of Vienna. There were 9 of them, among which the Papal States were one of the largest ones. The Congress also reinstated Austria in the territory of the former Republic of Venice, which stretched westward all the way to Milan. Italians resented this situation, especially as Austria tried to extend its influence into the politics of other Italian states. Now remember, Austria is a Catholic empire. If you remember, one of the most famous Austrians of the 20th century, who went by the name of Adolf Hitler, he was born to Catholic Austria. Okay? That's kind of important in this whole story. And it becomes important when World War II is getting going and the Pope is trying to figure out what to do with Germany. And we'll get into a little bit more, 19th and 20th century history as we get into this. The passion to rid Italy of the hated Austrians morphed easily into fervor to unite Italy. Fueled by the general upsurge of nationalist sentiment in Europe in the early 19th century and by the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 in France and elsewhere in Europe. Pius was similar to his predecessor, Pope Gregory XVI, in that he had to contend not only with the larger issue of unification of Italy, with all the questions that raised about the status of Rome and the Papal States, but with chronic political unrest in the states themselves. This is something that comes up in the book. These are states ruled by the pontiff himself as an earthly monarch. And, I was poking around in Twitter on the Swiss Guard, and there was a thread in Twitter that was talking about the fact that, these guys seem to be wearing these interesting anachronistic uniforms, but don't be fooled. They're well-trained with weapons, and they will use the halberd if they must, and they will kill you. If you try and, endanger the Pope or something like that. And right there's this element of, okay, well, what on earth is going on? What is this office? Who is this man? And part of what the book deals with is that people in the Papal States, at least I'm sure not all people, many people were deeply dissatisfied with the rule of the church directly. And this is where we're into this weird place now where you have Americans who get excited about dread Christian nationalism and we want more direct rule. And it's kind of like, well, that's not really working out so well for the Ayatollahs in Iran. And truth be told, it didn't work out real well in the Papal States. Do you really want... And I think in some ways, kind of the leftover of these periods still echoes through whenever someone in the United States talks about theocracy. It's so funny because I remember when George W. Bush took office, certain elements of the American left were talking about theocracy. And now that Trump's in, it's like there's a really nice element in, let's see, which one was it? I don't remember, but, Douthit was like, really nice with Douthit and Klein, because now we're having this moment where you have all sorts of non-Christians on the political left that are just say, well, we want Christians to act more Christian. And it's like, wasn't that long ago that you were afraid of the Christians and their dread theocracy that was supposedly over you? And now you look at all the post-Christians and you're like, I sure would like my political opponents to turn the other cheek. Well, they're not turning the other cheek anymore. And so the states were generally considered among the most backwards and ill-governed in Europe, and resentment of the government of priests was strong and growing stronger. In November 1848, just 2 years after his election, the tense situation in Rome forced Pius to flee the city and remain in exile until April 1850. He's fleeing his own people. He was able to return to Rome only by the humiliating expedients of appealing for aid to foreign power Louis Napoleon. The Prince President of France sent an expeditionary force that restored the city to Pius. Just think about that. France has to come in, and now post-Napoleon Bonaparte France, but one in the Napoleon family tree, has to come in and restore the Pope to his own kingdom because his own people ran him out of town. And it's like, well, how did Italy get unified and the Pope become a prisoner of the Vatican? In the middle of the century, the drive to unite Italy under the Piedmont monarchy was moving fast, a feat that could not be accomplished without including the states, which cut the peninsula in two. The leaders of the movement agreed, moreover, that Rome had to be the capital of the new nation. The popes of the 19th century, like their predecessors for centuries, considered the Papal States, and most especially the city of Rome, a sacred trust, a holy legacy they could never surrender. The Pope was more convinced of this truth than Pius IX. Now, if you look at this map, this is very interesting. Now, we don't see, this is a map of 1850. And when you compare this map, let's say 1850 to 1950, well, the Ottoman Empire's gone. World War I takes out the Ottoman Empire. Austria is sort of controlling good bits of Italy. You've got the Papal States. You've got the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And you just think about 1850 to 1950. And then you think, let's say, 1925 to 2025. Look at everything that changed between 1850 and 1925. It's enormous. Look at everything that changed between 1925 to 1975, where you'd have, well, then you've got the communist bloc there. And now think about 1975 to 2025, and the breakup of Yugoslavia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, all the change in the Balkans, Italy as a nation. I mean, the change is just astounding. By 1859, the Italian forces had occupied and controlled everything except a relatively small area near and around Rome, where they lay in wait for the opportunity to seize the city. That opportunity came in September 20, 1870, and shortly after, Pius IX declared the council in recess until November. The First Vatican Council was never able to reassemble. It abided in a state of limbo until July 14, 1960, when Pope John XIII cleared up doubts by letting it be known that the council had earlier announced called Vatican II. Technically speaking, the story of the First Vatican Council does not end until that day. Then you have these three pillars of liberalism: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. Now, for all the post-liberalism that we hear battered about today, I really wonder how many of them would want to put away these three freedoms. And it's incredibly important to remember that, and I'm going to continue to read on this, and those of you who know better than me, correct me in the comments. These freedoms aren't really, these freedoms were considered enemies of the papacy and the church. Vatican I was designed in many ways to hold these freedoms back. And it's not until Vatican II that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. On Substack, Jaska Munk has a pretty significant piece where he says Europe really is jailing people for online speech. And he goes through a whole bunch of incidences where in Europe, freedom of speech is being curtailed. Increasing numbers of malicious communication act in England it's pretty dramatic, some of these things. Now, what's so interesting is that you can look at this internal struggle in the Roman Catholic Church. Are the post-liberals really looking to overturn freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion in a way that was set before? The first two freedoms ultimately meant the end, or at least a significant reduction, of the censorship by church and state. And this was, of course, something that the church very much wanted from Franco and Mussolini. Now, Hitler, they couldn't manage at all. Freedom of religion meant the end of confessional state that had come into being with the Peace of Augsburg, which famously decreed that each ruler had the right to determine the form of Christianity which would take its realm and to insist on that its subjects conform to it. Undergirding these freedoms was the assumption that legitimate authority did not descend from on high, but rested upon the free assent of the governed. Although this assumption did not originate with the thinkers of the Enlightenment, they developed it more fully and passionately, and in an age of absolute monarchies, they wittingly and unwittingly imbued it with subversive force. Even more basic to the Enlightenment everywhere was the confidence in the power of human reason. It took different forms, many of which included the possibility of transcendent divine revelation. In its extreme form, however, it rejected the very possibility of realities beyond the power of reason to understand and strove to demystify any phenomena that claimed supernatural origin or sanction. Fundamental in every form was the belief that reason would continue to triumph over the past and over ignorant superstition and all forms of repression. Now, we're in this place now where there's sort of this reassessment of the Enlightenment. And so whether it's in the Christian Reformed Church or in the Roman Catholic Church, there are elements where people are sort of using the Enlightenment to bolster certain issues they would like to be brought forward. The French Revolution gets going, and the Roman Catholic Church is just sort of pushed back and rolled over and, just completely mauled. The government was simultaneously bent on conquest. By 1796, French troops under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Italy and eventually the Papal States, and they defeated the Papal army and forced the Pope to sue for peace. By the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Tolentino in 1797, Pius agreed to the French occupation of Bologna, Ferrara, and Ravenna, to allow French free access to all papal ports, to pay a huge indemnity, and to cede to France possessions of hundreds of precious manuscripts and works of art. That was not the end. The next year, the French occupied Rome and declared a Roman Republic. When Pius refused to abdicate as ruler of the Papal States, the French declared him deposed and placed him under surveillance. By July 1799, they had taken him to France and installed him, a virtual prisoner, in Valence, not far from Avignon, where he died there the next month. The town records noted his death simply as Citizen Braschi, occupation Pontiff. The humiliation of the papacy was complete. Its end, long predicted, had arrived. And again, think about something like that happening today. Just try to get your mind around that. Pius's successor, Leo XII, 1823 to 1829, after a stormy beginning, eventually continued Pius's policy of conciliation with other states. His policies within the Papal States, however, reversed many of the reforms. The Papal States were reinstated by the Treaty of Vienna. By his actions, Leo unfortunately consolidated world opinion about the political backwardsness of the Papal States and the ineptness of papal rule over them. Leo's repressive measures resulted in a police state, with spies and informers abounding and severe penalties imposed for even the slightest hint of incitement to civil unrest. He once again confined the Jews to the ghetto and had the gates fitted with locks. Such measures alienated his subjects, who now lay in wait for an opportunity to cast off the government of priests. From this point forward, political disturbances became endemic in the Papal States. Now, what's so amazing is that the stagecraft of the Vatican, this seems like an entirely different world. We're complaining about, not being kind to migrants. And there's this long history. And of course, I didn't know this history. You just see the Pope, you just see the robes, you just see and you're just doing some reading, and it's like, wow, have things changed? Things have changed dramatically. So you get this uprising in the Papal States. Gregory, even before he was elected, Gregory the 16th, I believe, a rebellion, in tandem with other revolutions that erupted across Europe in 1830, broke out in Bologna and spread through the Papal States, threatening Rome itself. The Papal army could not put it down. Gregory saved the situation only by calling upon Austria to quell the uprising, and when that was accomplished, by asking the troops to stay in order to maintain order. France then sent troops to do the same. The Pope's own subjects had rebelled against him, and he did not have the resources to constrain them. This was an ominous sign. With order restored, Gregory issued his first encyclical, Mirari Vos. In it, he put the blame for the rebellion, for the general depravity of the times, on the terrible conspiracy of evil men. Among the evil ideas spread by those shameless lovers of liberty were freedom of speech, freedom of the press, separation of church and state. The encyclical denounced freedom of conscience as absurd, erroneous, and delirium. The solution to such evils was the inculcation of obedience to legitimate princes. Thus, despite the grave difficulties the princes had caused the Holy See before the Revolution, Gregory committed the papacy to the restoration of the monarchies of the Ancien regime and to the traditional alliance of throne and altar. A silent target of the encyclical, it continues. This is obviously, then you have the beginning of the Ultramontane movement. They believed that a measure of distinctiveness among local churches was not only legitimate but wholesome, and that none of this more legitimate and wholesome than for the French church. So then you have this tension basically between the national church, sort of governed by kings, where kings and emperors have a lot of say in terms of what exactly is going on with the church. And again, back to Douthat's point, the church has so much authority that the rulers of the nations want the churches to backstop the king, and vice versa. And so you get this collaboration. One of the points that was made in Seabright's The Divine Economy was part of what happened in America was that you had this separation of church and state. And so churches just sort of run via a marketplace of ideas, and the state keeps their hands off. And you can begin to understand how, in the Great American Experiment, why separation of church and state is this enormous idea as compares to what's happening in Europe. And what tends to happen when you have this marriage between church and state is usually church loses. church loses because, again, influence. Catholics' painful memories of the anti-church action of the revolution and their full awareness of the current anti-church policy of their opponents had a powerful impact upon them. Experience had taught most Catholics that liberty, equality, and fraternity were a master plan to destabilize society. Fundamental to the Catholic experience in those years was, along with strong feelings of alienation, a profound sense of loss. Much of what they'd loved had been swept away. The little that was left was under assault. By 1750, for instance, there had been some 25,000 monasteries, convents, and similar houses of religious order in Europe, with approximately 350,000 members. By 1815, barely a handful remained. In France, the Dominicans had been completely wiped out, the devastation as great as any that occurred during the Reformation. Began with the suppression of the Jesuits, followed by the secularization of the secularizing actions of monarchs such as Emperor Joseph II. Then came the Revolution. During and after the Revolution, the victories of the French armies between 1782 and 1813 made it possible to implement the anti-monastic policies of the Revolution in most of Western Europe. And these things weren't put back. And so the idea was, well, if we strengthen the papacy, maybe we'll have sort of our own giant person to stand up against all of the other monarchs and emperors that are basically been taking them down. In some ways, by trying to enlarge the papacy, and I think you could hear this in James Martin, well, nobody's going to pay attention to the bishops. But now, especially in this era, it's the prolificity of the Pope that maybe can stand in the current culture. But that then is going to beg some questions because, of course, Douthit's piece on the Roman Catholic Church was all about the modernists wanted to use the papacy and its prolificity to do what? Well, it's all flowing through democracy now. The influence is flowing through democracy. Whereas before, it was flowing through, let's say, a throne. Well, my thoughts are, of course, unfinished. And you can finish them in the comment section. And I'll be super interested to hear what you think.